Book 1, Chapter 5 of Resurrection. The corridors of the court were already full of activity. The attendants hurried out of breath, dragging their feet along the ground without lifting them, backwards and forwards, with all sorts of messages and papers. Ushers, advocates, and law officers passed hither and thither. Plaintiffs and those of the accused who were not guarded wandered sadly along the walls or sat waiting. "Where is the law court?" Nekhludoff asked of an attendant. "Which? There's the civil court and the criminal court." "I'm on the jury." "The criminal court, you should have said. Here to the right, then to the left, the second door." Nekhludoff followed the direction. Meanwhile, some of the criminal court jurymen who were late had hurriedly passed into a separate room. At the door mentioned, 2 men stood waiting. One, a tall, fat merchant, a kind-hearted fellow, had evidently partaken of some refreshments and a glass of something, and was in most pleasant spirits. The other was a shopman of Jewish extraction. They were talking about the price of wool when Nekhludoff came up and asked them if this was the jurymen's room. "Yes, my dear sir, this is it." "One of us? On the jury, are you?" asked the merchant with a merry wink. "Ah, well, we shall have a go at the work together," he continued, after Nekhludoff had answered in the affirmative. "My name is Baklashef, merchant of the second guild," he said, putting out his broad, soft, flexible hand. "With whom have I the honour?" Nekhludoff gave his name and passed into the jurymen's room. Inside the room were about 10 persons of all sorts. They had come but a short while ago, and some were sitting, others walking up and down, looking at each other and making each other's acquaintance. There was a retired colonel in uniform. Some were in frock coats, others in morning coats, and only one wore a peasant's dress. Their faces all had a certain look of satisfaction at the prospect of fulfilling a public duty, although many of them had had to leave their businesses, and most were complaining of it. The jurymen talked among themselves about the weather, the early spring, and the business before them, some having been introduced, others just guessing who was who. Those who were not acquainted with Nekhludoff made haste to get introduced, evidently looking upon this as an honour, and he taking it as his due, as he always did when among strangers. Had he been asked why he considered himself above the majority of people, he could not have given an answer. The life he had been living of late was not particularly meritorious. The fact of his speaking English, French, and German with a good accent, and of his wearing the best linen, clothes, ties, and studs, bought from the most expensive dealers in these goods, he quite knew would not serve as a reason for claiming superiority. At the same time, he did claim superiority, and accepted the respect paid him as his due, and was hurt if he did not get it. In the jurymen's room his feelings were hurt by disrespectful treatment. Among the jury there happened to be a man whom he knew, a former teacher of his sister's children, Peter Gerasimovich. Nekhludoff never knew his surname, and even bragged a bit about this. This man was now a master at a public school. Nekhludoff could not stand his familiarity, his self-satisfied laughter, his vulgarity, in short. "Aha, you're also trapped!" These were the words, accompanied with boisterous laughter, with which Peter Gerasimovich greeted Nekhludoff. "Have you not managed to get out of it?" "I never meant to get out of it," replied Nekhludoff gloomily, and in a tone of severity. "Well, I call this being public-spirited. But just wait until you get hungry or sleepy. You'll sing to another tune then. This son of a priest will be saying 'thou.'" In Russian, as in many other languages, thou is used generally among people very familiar with each other, or by superiors to inferiors. "He will be saying 'thou' to me next," thought Nekhludoff, and walked away, with such a look of sadness on his face as might have been natural if he had just heard of the death of all his relations. He came up to a group that had formed itself around a clean-shaven, tall, dignified man, who was recounting something with great animation. This man was talking about the trial going on in the civil court, as of a case well known to himself, mentioning the judges and a celebrated advocate by name. He was saying that it seemed wonderful how the celebrated advocate had managed to give such a clever turn to the affair that an old lady, though she had the right on her side, would have to pay a large sum to her opponent. "The advocate is a genius," he said. The listeners heard it all with respectful attention, and several of them tried to put in a word, but the man interrupted them as if he alone knew all about it. Though Nekhludoff had arrived late, he had to wait a long time. One of the members of the court had not yet come, and everybody was kept waiting. End of Book 1, Chapter 5. Book 1, Chapter 6 of Resurrection. The President, who had to take the chair, had arrived early. The President was a tall, stout man with long grey whiskers. Though married, he led a very loose life, and his wife did the same, so they did not stand in each other's way. This morning he had received a note from a Swiss girl who had formerly been a governess in his house, and who was now on her way from South Russia to St. Petersburg. She wrote that she would wait for him between 5 and 6 p.m. in the Hotel Italia. This made him wish to begin and get through the sitting as soon as possible, so as to have time to call before 6 p.m. on the little red-haired Clara Vasilievna, with whom he had begun a romance in the country last summer. He went into a private room, latched the door, took a pair of dumbbells out of a cupboard, moved his arms 20 times upwards, downwards, forwards, and sideways, then, holding the dumbbells above his head, lightly bent his knees 3 times. "Nothing keeps one going like a cold bath and exercise," he said, feeling the biceps of his right arm with his left hand, on the 3rd finger of which he wore a gold ring. He had still to do the moulinet movement, for he always went through those 2 exercises before a long sitting, when there was a pull at the door. The President quickly put away the dumbbells and opened the door, saying, "I beg your pardon." One of the members, a high-shouldered, discontented-looking man with gold spectacles, came into the room. "Matthew Nikitich has again not come," he said in a dissatisfied tone. "Not yet," said the President, putting on his uniform. "He's always late." "It is extraordinary. He ought to be ashamed of himself," said the member angrily, and taking out a cigarette. This member, a very precise man, had had an unpleasant encounter with his wife in the morning, because she had spent her allowance before the end of the month, and had asked him to give her some money in advance, but he would not give way to her, and they had a quarrel. The wife told him that if he were going to behave so, he need not expect any dinner. There would be no dinner for him at home. At this point he left, fearing that she might carry out her threat, for anything might be expected from her. "This comes of living a good moral life," he thought, looking at the beaming, healthy, cheerful, and kindly President, who, with elbows far apart, was smoothing his thick grey whiskers with his fine white hands over the embroidered collar of his uniform. "He is always contented and merry, while I'm suffering." The secretary came in and brought some document. "Thanks very much," said the President, lighting a cigarette. "Which case shall we take first, then?" "The poisoning case, I should say," answered the secretary with indifference. "All right, the poisoning case let it be," said the President, thinking that he could get this case over by 4 o'clock and then go away. "And Matthew Nikitich, has he come?" "Not yet." "And Breve?" "He's here," replied the secretary. "Then if you see him, please tell him that we begin with the poisoning case." Breve was the public prosecutor, who was to read the indictment in this case. In the corridor, the secretary met Breve, who, with uplifted shoulders, a portfolio under one arm, the other swinging with the palm turned to the front, was hurrying along the corridor, clattering with his heels. "Michael Petrovitch wants to know if you're ready," the secretary asked. "Of course, I'm always ready," said the public prosecutor. "What are we taking first?" "The poisoning case." "Ah, that's quite right," said the public prosecutor, but did not think it at all right. He'd spent the night in a hotel playing cards with a friend who was giving a farewell party. Up to 5 in the morning they played and drank, so he had no time to look at this poisoning case, and meant to run it through now. The secretary, happening to know this, advised the president to begin with the poisoning case. The secretary was a liberal, even a radical, in opinion. Breve was a conservative. The secretary disliked him and envied him his position. "Well, and how about the Skoptsi, a religious sect?" asked the secretary. "I have already said that I cannot do it without witnesses, and so I shall say to the court." "Dear me, what does it matter?" "I cannot do it," said Breve, and waving his arm, ran into his private room. He was putting off the case of the Skoptsi on account of the absence of a very unimportant witness, his real reason being that if they were tried by an educated jury they might possibly be acquitted. By an agreement with the president, this case was to be tried in the coming session at a provincial town, where there would be more peasants, and therefore more chances of a conviction. The movement in the corridor increased. The people crowded most at the doors of the civil court, in which the case that the dignified man talked about was being heard. An interval in the proceeding occurred, and the old woman came out of the court, whose property that genius of an advocate had found means of getting for his client, a person versed in law, who had no right to it whatever. The judges knew all about the case, and the advocate and his client knew it better still, but the move they had invented was such that it was impossible not to take the old woman's property, and not to hand it over to the person versed in law. The old woman was stout, well dressed, and had enormous flowers on her bonnet. She stopped as she came out of the door, and spreading out her short fat arms and turning to her advocate, she kept repeating, "What does it all mean? Just fancy!" The advocate was looking at the flowers in her bonnet, and evidently not listening to her, but considering some question or other. Next to the old woman, out of the door of the civil court, his broad starched shirt front glistening from under his low-cut waistcoat, with a self-satisfied look on his face, came the celebrated advocate who had managed to arrange matters so that the old woman lost all she had, and the person versed in the law received more than 100,000 roubles. The advocate passed close to the old woman, and feeling all eyes directed towards him, his whole bearing seemed to say, "No expressions of deference are required." End of Book 1, Chapter 6.